Hey, good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. We're in video number 20 of our study of the prophets in the parables. So tonight we're going to continue on with Matthew 21 and the parable of the vineyard. This will be our last video in this parable. And tonight I want to focus on verse 43, where Jesus famously said to the Jews of his generation, "The kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it." Now, before we get into Daniel 7, which I believe serves as the primary source for Jesus' prophecy, let's make mention of a couple other Old Testament passages that stand behind this, that serve as this Old Testament background as well. Number one, Genesis 49 verse 10. The time when the kingdom was taken away from Old Covenant Israel was the time when the scepter departed from Judah. Number two, Daniel 12. The time when the kingdom was taken away from Israel was the time of the shattering of the power of the holy people, Daniel's holy people. And that took place following the Great Tribulation that Jesus placed within his first century generation. And number three, the time when the saints inherit the kingdom or receive the kingdom in Matthew 21:43 is the fulfillment of Isaiah 65 through 66. In that passage, we have God's judgment and destruction of an old covenant people, an old covenant creation, an old covenant kingdom, and the arrival of a new people with a new name, a new covenant kingdom, which is God's new covenant creation. So all of those passages, including Daniel 7, serve as a source for Matthew 21:43. But again, for the sake of time, let's just focus on Daniel 7:22 in tonight's video. So let's take a look, first of all, at the verbal parallels, okay? Matthew 21:43 says this, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to another people." This is undeniably the time when the saints receive the kingdom. Daniel 7:22 says this, "Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom." Matthew 21 is undeniably the fulfillment of Daniel 7:22, the time when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Now, let's notice the context of Daniel 7, because, again, and the only way we can understand Jesus' application of this passage, of this Old Testament prophet to his first century generation, is by digging into the context and the themes prevalent in Daniel chapter 7. So let's look at this. In Daniel 7, let's read verses 21 through 22. Notice this. "I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them." This is the 11th horn of the fourth beast of Rome. Okay, so this is a pagan, foreign, persecuting power, persecuting the saints of God, Daniel's holy people. "Until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom." So catch this. The saints inherit the kingdom as their vindication for suffering. In other words, the Lord comes, the Ancient of Days comes, rewards the saints with the kingdom, and judges their persecutors. So the kingdom is the vindication for the suffering saints. That's the context of Daniel 7 when the saints receive the kingdom. Well, guess what? That's the identical context and the identical themes that are at work in Matthew 21, except, as we've seen over and over and over again, Jesus again redefines the characters. Notice this. In Daniel 7, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but in Daniel 7, the saints of the highest one are Old Covenant Israel, Daniel's holy people, who are being persecuted by a pagan power. We've just seen that, but are vindicated at the coming of Yahweh. Watch this. Here's the twist. Here's where Jesus redefines Daniel's prophecy to apply to his first century, last days generation. In the parable of the restoration of the Lord's vineyard, Matthew 21, the saints of the Most High are now the followers of Jesus, who are being persecuted by the ethnic seed of Abraham, who have become identified with the pagan nations. In other words, the roles are switched. No longer is it Old Covenant Israel in general that are persecuted by the pagan foreign nations. Now, the true people of God, the saints of the highest one in Daniel 7, are the followers of Christ, the new covenant seed of Israel, the elect who are being persecuted by Old Covenant Jerusalem, which means Old Covenant first century Jerusalem, those who had rejected the stone that was being laid in Zion, are the pagan foreign nation, somehow affiliated with Daniel 7, the fourth beast, and the 11th horn. This is undeniable. This is unbelievable. Jesus is once again redefining the characters within the prophecies of the prophets, applying them to his first century generation to teach his disciples and the Jews who were rejecting him the judgment and the salvation that was coming upon them in their generation. Let's go on here. Furthermore, the coming of the Son of Man, or Jesus, who comes as the Ancient of Days, that's Daniel 7:22, to bring vengeance upon the wicked and the inheritance for the saints, is interpreted now as the coming of the owner of the vineyard for the very same purposes in Matthew 21. In other words, the coming of the Son of Man in Daniel 7 now is the coming of the Father of the Son of the owner of the vineyard, who's killed by those vine dressers. Jesus is Jehovah. He comes as the Ancient of Days. Here's another twist in the story. Not only are his followers the true seed of Israel and Old Covenant Israel the pagan persecuting power, but Jesus now comes as Jehovah. He comes as the Ancient of Days. He is the owner of the vineyard. He is the King of kings, and he comes in judgment and in the glory of his Father to bring both salvation and destruction upon those who would not obey him. This is the prerogative of the Father. Judgment is Jehovah's business, but he gives all judgment unto the Son, and the Son comes as one with the Father. Let me conclude. Thus, by alluding to this prophecy of Daniel, again, Matthew 21:43, alluding to Daniel 7:22, by alluding to this prophecy of Daniel, Jesus clearly understood that he was living in the anticipated last days and connected his own eschatological parousia, his second coming, with the judgment of Jerusalem and the time when the saints took possession of the kingdom. This means that the second coming of Jesus Christ and the rewarding of the saints with their kingdom inheritance was predicted to be accomplished at the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the end of the Jewish age in AD 70. And guess what? That's exactly what we see in all of those Old Testament sources that we alluded to. This is exactly what we see in Daniel 7. This is exactly what we see in Matthew chapter 21, and that's exactly what we see in the rest of the New Testament writings concerning the coming of the Lord, the establishment of the kingdom, the judgment of the wicked, and the vindication of the saints at the time when the saints take possession of the kingdom. Matthew 21, verse 43 is the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7, verse 22. The coming of Jesus Christ when the saints inherit the kingdom. This happened at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Anyways, that's it for tonight. Hope that was a blessing. We'll pick this up next time. I want to do a recap. We've been through so much in Matthew 21 in the parable of the vineyard. I'm going to take one more video to just recap this amazing parable, beginning with Jesus' three symbolic acts, following Jesus' allusion to the parable of the vineyard in Isaiah 5, which is a taunt song. We get into the parable of the two sons, and then finally, all of Jesus' imagery through the stone prophecies, and finally culminating in the explanation of everything that he has told previously. All of that imagery, all of that leads to the time when the Old Covenant kingdom of Israel was taken from the Jews and given to the true people of God, the righteous seed of Abraham in Jesus Christ. We'll pick it up next time on Answers on Eschatology. Have a great week. God bless.